Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. It was a freezing winter day in 2012, in a remote village in Siberia. 4-year-old Kolya was playing in the garden of his grandmother's wooden house. His small feet were sinking into the thick layer of snow, and he was having fun making snowballs with his tiny mittens. His parents worked in the city to make a living, so his grandmother took care of him. Though the elderly woman tried to keep an eye on her grandson, she couldn't follow him constantly because she was busy with housework. That day the weather was exceptionally cold. The thermometer showed 30 degrees C, and the sky was covered in gray clouds. A light wind blew, and snowflakes swirled down to the ground. Kolya, with curious eyes, was exploring his surroundings, gazing at the vast forest beyond the fence. The white paths between the trees looked like a fairy tale world to the little boy. Overcome by a sense of adventure, he stepped outside the garden without realizing it. At first, everything seemed fun. Kolya was walking, looking for a bigger area where he could make a snowman. He left tracks in the soft snow, occasionally stopping to bend down and gather more snow. However, without realizing it, he had crossed the fence and entered the forest just outside the village. The thick snow cover absorbed his footsteps, and everything was blanketed in an eerie silence. Kolya didn't yet have a concept of time. He didn't know how far he had walked. The paths between the trees all looked the same, and when he turned around, he had no idea how to return to the garden. Slowly, a sense of worry began to grow inside him, but instead of crying out of fear, he kept walking. Despite his young age, he was brave, but as darkness began to fall, a sense of unease filled him. By the evening, his grandmother opened the door to call him back inside, but there was no sign of him in the garden. At first, she thought he might have gone into his room, but after searching every corner of the house, she realized that Kolya wasn't inside. Filled with worry, she stepped outside and started calling for him, shouting, "Kolya, where are you, my son? Come inside." But the only response from the forest was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Within minutes, her concern turned into panic. She alerted the villagers and everyone mobilized to search for Kolya. With flashlights in hand, they entered the forest, trying to follow his tracks. But the snowstorm had already erased any traces. The night was cold and merciless. The thermometer was dropping quickly, and the freezing air was like a knife cutting through their lungs. The villagers were worried about the risk of freezing to death. A 4-year-old child had almost no chance of surviving in such extreme cold. Authorities were notified and search and rescue teams were deployed. But time was quickly running out. Deep in the forest, Kolya, with his tiny body, was fighting against the cold all alone. As Kolya noticed the forest around him darkening, an indescribable fear took over him. During the day, everything had looked less frightening. The snowflakes clung to the branches, giving the forest a magical appearance. But now, as the last rays of the sun disappeared, the shadows grew longer, and the massive trees became eerie silhouettes. He was only 4 years old, but he was starting to realize the danger he was in. He stuffed his hands deep into his woolen mittens to try to warm up, but it didn't help much. The freezing cold seeped through every gap in his thin coat and pants, making him feel as though needles were stabbing into his skin. His small feet were sinking deeper into the snow, and with each step it became more difficult to move. Kolya's stomach began to growl. He thought of the warm soup his grandmother used to make. His hunger was one thing, but the growing fear inside him felt heavier. He muttered to himself, "Mom, Grandma, I want to go home." But his voice was only heard by the cold wind. He tried not to cry. His mother always told him to be strong. If he got lost, he should find a place to hide and wait. Kolya looked around and started searching for a place. As he wandered deeper into the forest, he noticed a small hollow created by thick roots at the base of a tree. It looked like a place where he could be somewhat protected from the wind. With all his strength, he crawled into the hollow, pulling his knees up to his chest and trying to shrink as much as possible. But the frozen ground sent unbearable cold into his body. Shivering, he cupped his chin in his hands and tried to remember the nights when his grandmother would wrap him in blankets and tell him stories. Now, here he was, all alone in the desolate, dark forest. As hours passed, the cold grew sharper. Kolya's eyelashes had even frozen and his breath turned into a white mist that blended with the air. He could no longer feel his fingertips. He was getting sleepy, but his grandmother had always told him not to sleep when he was this cold. She had warned him that if he fell asleep, he might never wake up again. The little boy forced himself to stay awake even as his eyelids grew heavy. Then he heard a sound from the distance, a deep, echoing, chilling howl. Kolya's eyes widened. He knew that wolves lived in the forest. His grandmother had told him to be cautious of wild animals if he ever found himself in the forest at night. Now, in the dark, there might be eyes watching him. Instinctively, he shrank even further, pulling his knees to his chest and covering his ears with his hands. His heart was racing. Wolves couldn't reach him, could they? He was just a small child. They wouldn't notice him. But the howls were getting closer and closer. Kolya squeezed his eyes shut and, as his grandmother had taught him, began to pray in his mind. When he was younger, she had told him that praying would make him feel safe. In his helplessness, he whispered, "Please take me home. Please let me see my mom." His stomach growled and his body trembled. But the only thing he could do to survive was to stay still and wait. Tears burned his cheeks as he wondered if he could make it until morning. But a voice inside him told him not to give up. The freezing cold had taken over his entire body. His eyelids were heavy, and his mind was clouding. But one thing he knew for sure: if he fell asleep, he might never wake up. The news of Kolya's disappearance quickly spread through the village. When his grandmother realized he wasn't in the garden, she first alerted the neighbors. She thought maybe he had gone to someone else's house, but no one had seen him. As the minutes passed, her concern turned to panic. The little boy couldn't survive for long in this freezing cold. The day had begun to darken and the temperature had dropped below 30 degrees Celsius. His grandmother was now breathless. Her eyes filled with tears as she cried out, "Kolya, where are you? My son, can you hear me?" But the only answer echoing through the vast forest was the wind and the rustling of the pine trees. Hearing the grandmother's cries, the neighbors immediately rushed to help. It was a small village and everyone knew each other. From children to the elderly, everyone came together to search for Kolya. While the women stayed at home praying, the men ventured into the forest with flashlights and torches. A few people alerted the village hunters. These were the ones who knew the forest well, who could read the signs of wild animals. If anyone could find Kolya's tracks, it would be them. But there was a major problem: the heavy snowfall. Kolya's small footprints had already been covered by a thick layer of snow. It was nearly impossible to figure out which direction he had gone. The villagers scattered in different directions, each one beginning to search a different part of the forest. The flashlights cut through the dark forest like faint beams of light, and the light hitting the tree trunks created strange shadows. But no matter how much they shouted, there was no trace of Kolya. That night, when the villagers couldn't find the child on their own, they contacted the authorities. Within hours, the police and search and rescue teams arrived in the village. With thermal cameras, specially trained dogs, and powerful spotlights, the search efforts became more organized. But even technology was no match for the relentless cold. One of the teams focused on the northern part of the forest. This area was known to be frequented by wild animals. There were wolf tracks, but still no sign of Kolya. Other teams were investigating whether the child had accidentally wandered to a riverbank. Frozen rivers posed a great danger. The thin ice could crack under even the smallest weight. If Kolya had fallen into the water, his chances of survival were nearly zero. With every passing minute, hope was diminishing. Kolya's parents had rushed back to the village from their jobs in the city. When they heard their child was missing, they couldn't believe their eyes. How could such a small child possibly get lost in the forest alone in such freezing weather? The mother collapsed into her mother's arms, tears streaming down her face as she screamed in desperation, "Find my son, please find him!" The father, trying to appear strong, was clearly terrified, his fear evident in his eyes. His hands trembled as he gripped his flashlight tighter and joined the rescue teams. No one slept through the night. The villagers and rescue teams kept moving to stay warm, but by dawn, their hope was beginning to fade. How could a child survive in such cold? With the first light of morning, one of the rescue teams decided to go deeper into the forest. The villagers who had gone out earlier reported seeing several wolf packs throughout the night. If Kolya was still alive, they needed to find him before the wolves did. Time was running out. Kolya's family and the whole village wouldn't stop until they found him, but they were up against a ruthless enemy, the freezing cold of Siberia. When Kolya opened his eyes, he was still alive, but it hadn't been easy. He had fought against the cold all night, trembling from hunger and fear, waiting. Now it was morning, but everything around him was still frozen and silent. His small body was almost numb. His hands and feet felt as if they didn't belong to him anymore. At first, he couldn't move much on the snow. Slowly, he tried to wiggle his fingers. Though he couldn't fully understand the danger, he sensed that something was wrong. Hunger was also becoming unbearable. It had been hours since his last meal the previous afternoon. His stomach was empty, and it began to growl. Instinctively, he started looking around for something to eat. Unable to bear his hunger any longer, Kolya bent down and scooped a handful of snow into his mouth. At first it felt fresh and cooling, but after a few bites, his teeth began to ache. The snow was so cold, and the more he ate, the colder it made him. His grandmother had once told him, "Don't eat too much snow or you'll get sick." Now he understood what that meant, but he had no other choice. To ease his hunger and thirst, he continued to eat the snow. Soon his lips turned blue, and his trembling increased. His stomach twisted painfully, but there was nothing he could do about it. Having experienced the freezing cold of the night, Kolya realized he couldn't survive out in the open. He needed to find shelter. He looked around, searching for a safer place in the snow. A little further ahead, the roots of a fallen tree had formed a mound covered in snow. The little boy thought he could dig a hole under it. Moving slowly, he began to dig the frozen snow with his hands. He couldn't feel his hands, but his instincts kept him going. After a while, he managed to create a small cavity he could crawl into. He immediately curled up inside, making himself as small as possible and pulling his knees to his chest. This gave him some protection from the wind, but the cold was still merciless. Kolya didn't know how long he could stay there, but he could feel that if he fell asleep, he might never wake up. So he started singing to distract himself, humming an old Russian children's song his grandmother had taught him. The owl flies, searching for the night. Little stars shine bright. His small voice echoed through the forest. At that moment, he didn't feel so alone. Hours later, Kolya heard a sound in the forest. At first he was scared. Was it a wolf approaching, or maybe a bear? His small body stiffened in fear and he held his breath. But as he listened more closely, he realized it was a barking sound. He immediately lifted his head and searched with his eyes for the source of the sound. A short time later, he saw a hunting dog struggling through the snow. The dog, a large animal with brown and white fur, lowered its nose to the ground, as if tracking scents. When it neared Kolya's hole, it paused for a moment, sniffing the air. The little boy raised his hands with excitement and whispered in a faint voice, "I'm here. You found me." But his voice was so weak that he almost couldn't hear it himself. Gathering all his strength, he tried to shout louder, "I'm here, hey!" Unfortunately, his voice wasn't strong enough. The dog lifted its head, stared at the child for a few seconds, then suddenly ran off in a different direction. Kolya's heart sank. This could have been his rescue, but he couldn't make himself heard. Desperately, he watched the dog run away, trying to hold back his tears, but he couldn't. After the dog left, Kolya's hope shattered. He started crying, but he knew crying wouldn't save him. He didn't know what to do, but he had to find a way to survive. His body was growing numb, but despite everything, he had to keep fighting. He curled up even more in his small hole and waited. Somewhere in the forest, there were people searching for him. But would they be able to find him in time? It was the morning of the third day in the freezing forests of Siberia. The sky was gray and gloomy, as if nature itself was mourning Kolya's painful weight. Alone in the darkness of the night, when the little boy opened his eyes at dawn, he felt that his body was no longer obeying him. His hands and feet felt frozen, and he could hardly feel his fingertips. Hunger had twisted his stomach, and his head began to spin. Kolya thought about the hunting dog he had encountered the day before. Would the dog come back? At that moment, his greatest hope was that this friendly animal would follow the scent and bring people to him. But hours passed and no movement, no sound was heard. All he could do was wait a little longer. So he curled up tightly inside his thin jacket and began to murmur the prayer his grandmother had taught him. "Please, let me go home. Let me see my mom." But his voice was almost just a whisper. That same morning, the team searching, for Kolya realized that time was running out. It was the third day, and how could a child survive for so long in 30°C temperatures? The authorities decided to widen the search area. Teams were directed to areas covered in thick snow that hadn't been searched before. Trained dogs tried to pick up the lost child's scent, and thermal cameras scanned for temperature variations in the forest. But the cold was their greatest enemy. At that moment, one of the hunting dogs began to act restlessly. It lowered its nose to the ground, sniffed the air, and quickly moved in a specific direction. The handler noticed and called out, "Follow it. It's caught a scent." The team immediately sprang into action, struggling through the thick snow. After about a 10-minute walk, one of the team members suddenly stopped and listened intently. A faint child's voice could be heard in the distance. It wasn't very clear, blending with the sound of the wind, but everyone in the forest fell silent. They listened carefully, hoping to hear it again. Then they heard it again. A faint whisper. "I'm here." The team immediately rushed toward the source of the sound. The flashlights created flickering beams of light in the white forest, each member scanning their surroundings carefully. Finally, amidst the thick layer of snow, a small hole was spotted. One team member ran toward the hole. At first, they couldn't make out what was inside, but then they saw a small figure, Kolya. The child lay curled up in his thin jacket, his breath very weak, his face pale, but he was still alive. The rescue team let out a collective sigh of relief. A miracle had happened. They quickly reached the child. One of the team members knelt down and gently touched Kolya's tiny shoulders. "Kolya, we found you. Can you hear me?" Kolya slightly opened his eyes. He felt like he was in a dream. His frozen lips barely moved, and with a trembling voice he whispered, "Mom." The team member's eyes filled with tears. The fact that the little boy could still speak showed just how strong he was. Blankets were immediately brought out. Kolya's frozen body needed to be kept warm. If he was suddenly exposed to heat, he could go into shock, which would be dangerous for him, so they needed to warm him up slowly. One team member gently picked up the child. Kolya's body was so light that hunger and exhaustion had left him weak. The team leader called in on the radio. "The child has been found. He's alive. We're evacuating him immediately." As Kolya was wrapped in blankets and carried to a warmer place, he was still trying to understand if everything was real. He had been alone for so long, scared and hopeless. But now, he was safe. When they brought him back to the village, his parents ran toward him screaming in joy and embraced their child. His grandmother knelt down and held his hand, tears streaming down her face. For everyone, it was a miracle. The villagers and rescue teams hugged each other in celebration. The little boy, who had survived for 3 days in freezing cold, had become a symbol of resilience. Kolya completely recovered after several weeks of treatment and rest. But this event remained etched in his memory as a moment he would never forget. Sometimes at night he still dreamed he was in the forest, but when he opened his eyes and saw his family beside him, he knew he was safe. When Kolya was found, his body felt like a frozen statue. The paleness of his skin, his purple lips, and his unmoving body showed the extent of the hardship he had endured. The medical team and the rescue unit sighed with relief when they saw that he was still breathing. But they had to act quickly. A few of the team members carefully wrapped him in blankets. If they heated him up suddenly, he might go into shock, so they needed to warm him gradually. The rescue worker who was holding Kolya also gently patted his back, trying to keep him conscious. "Kolya, we're here. Don't close your eyes, we're taking you home." The little boy barely managed to open his eyes. Everything was blurry. Snow-covered trees, the flickering lights of the flashlights, and the people running around him. He wondered if he was in his imagination or if he had really been rescued. His lips moved faintly, and in a barely audible voice he whispered, "I want to go home." A medical worker couldn't hold back their tears and gently squeezed the child's hand. "You're going home, sweetie. You were so strong." When Kolya was brought back to the village, his parents rushed to the ambulance. As soon as his mother saw his little face, she broke down in tears. "Kolya, my son," she screamed, trying to take him in her arms, but the doctors gently stopped her. "We need to get him to the hospital right away. He's at risk for hypothermia." Kolya was conscious but very weak. As his body began to warm up, he suddenly started shaking violently. He couldn't make fists with his hands, and he couldn't lift his arms. His little body had been pushed to its limits after 3 days in freezing temperatures. The ambulance sped down the road. His parents sat helplessly by his side. His mother held his hand while his father continuously stroked Kolya's hair. "Hang in there, son. You're going home." Kolya closed his eyes and opened them again. He was tired, but for the first time, he was in a warm environment, and it gave him peace. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors immediately took Kolya to the emergency room. His body temperature had dropped to dangerously low levels. Normally, a human body's temperature is around 37 degrees, but his had fallen to 33 degrees. The doctors knew that they needed to warm him up slowly. They wrapped him in special thermal blankets, gave him warm fluids, and performed gentle massages to stimulate his blood circulation. While Kolya's parents anxiously waited in the hospital's waiting room, one of the doctors came over to them. "Kolya is a strong child. He was about to go into hypothermia, but his body is resilient. His condition is stable for now. If he doesn't contract an infection and if there's no organ damage, he should recover in a few days." Hearing this, Kolya's mother wiped away her tears and hugged her husband. "Our son is a warrior," she said with joy. Kolya's first night in the hospital was very challenging. His body was still in shock, and he occasionally suffered from shivering episodes. However, the doctors stayed with him, keeping a close watch. On the second day, Kolya's family was allowed to visit him. His mother sat by his bed, and his father held his tiny hand. When Kolya opened his eyes, he saw his parents. His lips were cracked, but he tried to smile faintly. "When can we go home?" Upon hearing this, his mother cried happily and kissed his forehead. "Very soon, my sweet." Within a few days, Kolya began to recover rapidly. As his body healed from the freezing cold, he started feeling stronger. The doctors checked for signs of frostbite on his fingers, but fortunately there was no serious frostbite. This was a true miracle. One of the doctors came over to Kolya and smiled, gently patting his shoulder. "You're such a brave boy. Surviving on your own for 3 days? You really accomplished something incredible." Kolya's story spread quickly within the hospital. Nurses and doctors began to see him as a little hero. Many visitors came to see him, eager to know how he had managed to survive such harsh conditions. Kolya's survival story didn't only affect his family and village, it touched the entire world. News channels reported the incredible event with the headline, "4-year-old survives for 3 days in 30-degree cold." People from all over Russia sent messages of support to Kolya and his family. Some journalists came to the hospital to interview his family, but Kolya's parents wanted to wait until he fully recovered before speaking to the media. When Kolya was discharged from the hospital a few weeks later, a big surprise awaited him in the village. The villagers had organized a small celebration for him. The little boy had become everyone's hero. A journalist approached him with a microphone and asked, "How did you survive for 3 days in the forest, Kolya?" Kolya smiled faintly and shyly answered, "I sang my grandmother's songs, and I endured by thinking of my mom." This simple yet heartfelt answer touched everyone's heart. Kolya's story didn't just show the resilience of a child, it demonstrated the incredible strength of the human spirit. Despite the cold, hunger, and fear, he had survived. And now, he was not only his family's miracle child, but the miracle child of the entire world.